Hello, this is Tim64 aka On The Stoop, and welcome to this exclusive video for kickstartpoker.com on bluff catching in low limit 6 max sit and goes. And a quick look at my own website. Do feel free to contact me here if you want any coaching help with your poker game. And without further ado, let's jump into some interesting bluff catching spots. So whenever we're thinking about bluff catching, we need to bear in mind various principles in order to help us to make the decision about whether to call or to fold. And the first and most important principle that we need to think about is what price are we being offered on our call. So when we're facing a bet from our opponent, what proportion of our stack is the call and what odds are we getting? So let's use this first hand here, King Queen offsuit, to demonstrate the different pot odds that we're going to get facing different bet sizes. So I'm not going to go into the play leading up to the decision in too much detail. That's something for a different video, so we'll just get to the decision point fairly quickly. We raise this hand up from the hijack, we get a call from the cutoff. He's a very loose player. We go heads up and we flop top pair. It's a fairly drawy board here, and we elect to check to control the size of the pot, and at this point our opponent shoves all in. Now what you can see here is when we're facing this huge bet, it's actually giving us very bad odds to make the call. So we can see down here our pot odds are 1.3 to 1, so we need equity of 43%. What that means is we have to be right here, we have to be correct at least 43% of the time to make a good call. Now we'll come back to this hand in a moment, but I want to contrast that with another spot where we can see that we're getting a much better price. Okay, so here's the second hand. As you can see, it's a heads up pot, so there's an open raise. We make a call with ace-4. That you could definitely 3-bet shove this hand, but we decided to call. King 7-7 flop gets checked through by both players, and then on the turn there's another check and another check, and then on the river we face a half pot bet here. So you can see when our opponent bets half pot here, the odds we're getting on a call are much better. Here we're getting 3 to 1 on a call, and therefore we only need to be correct. Ace high only needs to be the best hand 24% of the time in order for us to make a break even or better call. So price is always your first question. How often do I need to be right here to make this call? Alright, so to illustrate the next factor that we need to have in mind, we're going to use this 8-6 suited hand that we played. This hand was played on the bubble of a 6 max tournament, so it's raised by the small blind and we elect to make a call. You can see he has a very high small blind steal, 80%. And we go to the flop here. Our opponent makes a bet. We make a pretty light float here. As you can see, we don't have any direct equity, but we do have some backdoor flush draws, and we have some backdoor straight draws, and it's a very small bet. So obviously at this point we don't have a hand. We turn probably the best possible card for us, and our opponent checks here, and we make a bet with our draw, and on the river our opponent open shoves into us, and we have about pot size here. Now obviously we river a straight here, but our hand is definitely not the nuts, but it is very strong. So our opponent can have a beat here. He can have some full houses such as 10-9, 10-7. These hands are possible. But since we're at the top of our range, we can usually call even if the price is not great. So even if the odds we're getting are not great, the stronger our hand is compared to all the possible hands in our range, the more often we're going to be calling. And so here we go ahead and make the call, and we see a more or less pure bluff from our opponent. But let's say if in this situation we had a much weaker hand, let's say a hand like 5-6, we would be much less inclined to call there. Okay, so we're going to go back to this king-queen hand now and try to illustrate the next concept that I want to talk about. So we'll get to the point on the flop where we check and our opponent bets all in. And here what we want to think about is how strong or weak does our own hand look. And in this case here, when we check this board, which is quite drawy, our hand looks pretty weak. Now, the weaker that your hand looks, the more often your opponent is likely to prey upon that weakness or to attack that weakness with a bet with a weak range. So what that means is, even though in this case, as you can see, we're not getting great odds on the call, we have to be right, nearly half the time here, and it's obviously our whole tournament life on the line here. It doesn't make very much sense for our opponent to be betting this big with a hand that's actually strong, because we're representing weakness. So for example, if our opponent had a hand like Queen 10 here for the flopped straight, it wouldn't make sense for him to bet this big, because he'd actually be pushing us out of the pot with many of the hands that he wants us to call with. So another way of saying this is, and in very sort of basic terms, if it looks like your opponent is trying to bluff you off the pot, which it certainly does in this case, there's a fairly decent chance that that's exactly what's happening. So in this case, we just go ahead, make the call, and we see that our opponent shows up with this double gut shot here, and gets it in with pretty poor equity. And so I don't think he would have done this if we had bet ourselves on the flop, because he would have probably just called, because we would have represented some strength, but he saw the weakness and wanted to attack that weakness. So the weaker that your hand looks, the more you should be inclined to bluff catch. Okay, so we'll move on now to the next principle, which is polarization. Okay, so here's our hand that we're going to use to demonstrate this. It's 7-8 offsuit, certainly not a powerhouse of a hand, and we make a fairly light open raise from the cutoff. One of the reasons for that is wanting to play a pot with this loose and probably weak player in the big blinds. So we raise this hand up, and we do get a call from him. We flop second pair here on a 7-King-4 board, and our opponent checks to us, and we go ahead and make a continuation bet around half pot, just a little bit less, and we get called. And the board is something more or less like a blank, and it goes check check, and on the river our opponent leads out here for a little bit over half pot. So what we want to think about here is how often he's betting for value with the kinds of hands that we expect him to have when he calls on the flop. So if we think about what he can have when he calls on the flop, he can have a 7x hand, a 4x hand, a hand like 5-6, a flush draw, any kind of king, and those are the obvious hands we expect to see in his range. Now when we get to this particular river here, many of those hands should be frightened about this card. So a 7x won't typically lead this river to bet for value, because it doesn't make sense in that he can't get called by many worse hands. The same is true of a 4. It doesn't make sense to bet here with a 4 because you're not going to get called by worse. Even a king will sometimes be frightened that I have an ace because I was the original raiser and may check here. The hands that will bet for value here are hands like a7, and obviously flush draws that got there on the river. But given how small his value betting range should be, and that means he's actually going to be very polarized here, which means that he either has a very strong hand or he has nothing at all. And therefore, if that's the case, your actual hand strength becomes less important because your opponent either has it or he doesn't. In this case, we decided to make the call, and we see that our opponent actually had a very weak hand which he decided to turn into a bluff on the river. In fact, he is betting this hand, but he's clearly turning this hand into a bluff because there's no value for him in this bet against worse hand. I don't mind this bet. Obviously, the call pre-flop is very loose, and sometimes when you play a very wide range of hands, you're going to have to turn a lot of those hands into bluffs or just bluff outright in order to win the pot. Okay, and let's move on to the next hand. And for this, we're going to have Ace 7 of diamonds, which we open up from hijack, and we get a call. Now this player is playing 74% of hands. Now that means he has a very, very wide range of hands. And the principle that we're interested in here is that the wider your opponent's range of hands, the more he's going to have to bluff to compensate for having a wide and therefore often weak range of hands. And what that means is that you're going to be able to make lighter calls against his bets. So you don't need such a strong hand to make a call. So we get heads up here and flop second pair with our good ace kicker. So we go ahead and make a continuation bet, and we get called by our opponent. The turn is a 5. Now he will have some 5x hands in his range, that's certainly true, but at the same time not as many as all the other types of hand that he could be calling this flop with. So if we think about what kinds of hands there might be, they could be any sort of gut shot here, like a hand like 6-8, any kind of flush draw, hands like King Jack, Queen Jack, he might even decide to float with those. Of course, he will also have some 10x hands here, but he might not bet those hands on the turn. So when we go ahead and check here, and he bets here, again he's representing a very strong hand. He's representing that he has trips, but if we think about how many hands he has overall, it's actually a very small number of those hands are actually going to be ahead of us. So given the price we're getting, over 3-1, only needing to be right here on the turn about 24% of the time, we can make a fairly easy call here. And on the river, when there's another 5, it's really unlikely that we're behind now. Unless our opponent has a 10, we're good. So we're usually going to be willing to bluff catch this river. In fact, he just gives up here, and we see him show down with absolutely nothing. And this is what I mean. When you have a very weak and wide range, you're going to be forced to bluff in order to win those pots, because your hand doesn't have natural strength. It doesn't have pot equity, so you need to generate bluff equity. Okay, so what we're going to do now is just to look at 2 or 3 more hands, trying to put all these factors together. So first hand is this A7 offsuit hand, which we're opening from middle position 5-handed. I think this is a pretty light open. I'm not that big a fan of it, but there are some weaker players on this table, so it's probably not too terrible. We get called by Button, who's on the looser side, but seems solid enough. And we flop nothing much here, make a continuation bet of just under half pot, and we get called on this board. So when we get called on this board, the range of hands that we would put our opponent on is something like Queen Jack for straight draws, maybe even King Queen for gut shots, hands like pocket 8s, pocket 6s, these kinds of hands, maybe some ace high hands. So we get to the turn and actually turn our top pair. Now if we bet again here, we're going to force our opponent to fold many hands. This is a really good scare card to bet if you don't have anything here, but since our ace is of only medium strength, and if we do get called here, it's likely to be by better aces or big hands like pocket maybe sets or something like that, we're gonna go with the check here. So we check here and our opponent bets here. And again, if we think about the principles that we've been talking about here, when we're expected to bet this scare card and we don't, our hand looks quite weak to our opponent. So when we've shown weakness, he's going to be more liable to bluff. Certainly all those hands that he has here that don't have showdown are going to need to bluff. If he has a hand like 10 Jack, for example, he probably will check that hand back. Similarly, hands like pocket eights might well check back here. So his betting range becomes more weighted to bluffs. In terms of the price we're getting here on the turn, we're getting nearly 3 to 1, so we only need to be right about a quarter of the time, so it's a fairly easy check call once we've taken this line. And on the river, more or less a blank, we check and our opponent gives up, and he does show a gut shot. I think his float is, you know, not unreasonable on the flop, a little bit thin, but okay. On to the next hand. So this is a hand that we looked at very briefly earlier on when we were talking about the price we're getting. So once again, we'll just run through the action. We make the call pre-flop heads up with the weak ace, and the flop is checked, the turn is checked, and then on the river we check and we face a half pot bet. Now again, as we've said here, our opponent's line doesn't make a lot of sense. You know, it really looks like he's using this scare card to bluff. If he had a 7, we would have expected him to bet earlier, and indeed if he had any kind of king here, we would have expected him to bet at least on the turn. So given all those factors and the fact that we're getting a good price on our call and we only need to be right here, we go ahead and make the call here. And it actually turns out that our opponent was slow playing a very strong hand here. I kind of like the way he played that hand. I think there was some potential for value on the turn, but he played it in a very, let's say, tricky way and made us overvalue our own ace high hand because he played his hand in such a weak manner. But I think the bluff catcher on the river is, you know, semi-reasonable. This is actually a pretty good player. And again, it comes down to the price we're getting and how weak our own hand looks here. We've shown no strength at any point in the hand, and therefore we have to assume our opponent's a little bit more liable to bluff us with his non-showdown value hands. Okay. Alright, so we've got now pocket 7s for this next hand. And this is actually a 3-bet pot, so we face a raise from cutoff. And instead of flatting this smallish pair out of position, we decide to make a 3-bet, which I think is reasonable. Our opponent is raising quite a few hands, 42% here, open first in open raise, so we should get a decent amount of folds when we make this 3-bet. We get a call, and there are 2 overcards on the board. This is definitely not a board we want to see, and indeed it's fairly good for his range. We do go ahead and make a smallish continuation bet, and we get called here. And on the turn, which is not a complete blank but largely a blank in that the only hand that gets there is Jack 9, we elect to check. So once again, in this line, we're showing quite a lot of weakness. It looks like we've taken one stab at the pot and then we've given up. And we then see an all-in shove from our opponent. Now it's certainly possible for him to have a hand like King Queen or Ace Queen. But if we think about how he would be likely to play such a hand, if you have Ace Queen or King Queen here and your opponent appears to be giving up on the turn, you know instinctively that you've got the best hand, and at that point you will want to extract as much value as you can. So you're much more likely to make a bet of 300, 400 chips here rather than shoving all in. This bet really looks like it's trying to get me to fold. And as we said before, if your hand looks weak and your opponent is betting a very big size in proportion to the pot, and a big size given that your hand looks weak, he's going to be weighted towards bluffs or semi-bluffs rather than pure value hands. So we do make a bit of a crying call with the 7s here. Never going to be too happy, and we see that our opponent was semi-bluffing on the turn with his gut shot. I don't mind his line too much. He does have fairly decent equity against our actual hand. But again, it goes to show that if you pay attention to these tells, these kinds of bet sizing tells, and keep these principles in mind when you're trying to think about whether or not to bluff catch, you're more likely to make good decisions in the long run. One final example to show again that we can make reasonable decisions without always having to be right. And we have another heads up pot here with 10-7 suited. We face an open raise from a very good and aggressive player. He's raising 65% first in here, so we can defend quite wide against this. I think 10-7 suited is a reasonable defend. You could 3-bet shove this hand. We go ahead and defend, and we hit our second pair. So we start with the check and our opponent bets. It's a fairly small bet. You can see we're getting good odds on a call, so no reason not to call there. And we hit a 9 on the turn. That's not bad for our range because we will have some hands like 9-10, 8-9 for gut shots that we might decide to call the flop with. And at this point the action goes check, check, and there's another 9 on the river. And we check again. Now at this point it's clear that we don't have a 9, because if we had trips here we'd almost always lead them for value. We probably would lead a jack for value as well on the river, because that's likely to be the best hand. So when we check here, our hand looks very weak and our opponent makes a fairly big bet size here. Now you can see that the odds we're getting on a call are not too bad. We need to be right here just under 30% of the time. Because of how weak our hand looks, I decided to make the call here, and actually we see that villain had a very nicely played hand. He actually checked back his turn straight in order to disguise the strength of his hand, in order to, let's say, force us to bluff catch a bit more on the river with our weaker hands here. So for example, if we have a jack here, let's say a hand like king jack, we probably would bluff catch that hand you know, fairly happily on most rivers. But if we had a hand like ace deuce, or you know, just a 7x, we're not going to want to necessarily cool down here. So by checking back and making his hand look weaker, he induces us to bluff catch a little bit more on the river. So very nice, very nicely played hand by him. And I think our bluff catch is close here on the river, but again we're not getting too terrible a price, and our hand does look weak, so I think we can justify it. So next time you're facing a bet from your opponent and you have a sneaking feeling that you're getting bluffed, try to think about these factors, these principles that we've talked about here today, and put them into practice before you click the call or fold button. Once again, this was Tim64 aka On the Stoop for Kickstart Poker, and I hope this bluff catching video was useful to you. Thank you.